Have we talked about this yet? Do you understand what I mean? Geochemical nutrient cycles. Geo, what does that mean? Earth. Chemical means chemicals, yeah? Nutrients, what does that mean? That means nutrients. And then cycling means these things go around in cycles, yeah? The carbon cycle, the nitrogen cycle, the phosphorus cycle. Your textbook will talk about a couple other kinds of cycles. Don't worry about those. These are the only ones I care about, yeah? I want you to get this holistic concept, I guess, and some other things are important too. All right, so the need for molecules rests upon the need to have the atoms of which those molecules are comprised. Does that make sense? All living things need to have carbohydrates, lipids, proteins, nucleic acids, yeah? You guys agree? Those are found in all life, including us, including all microbes, yeah? Well, in order to make those, if those are made out of atoms, we would need to have those atoms in order to make those molecules. Does that make sense? All right. So, which of those four kinds of molecules needs to have nitrogen atoms? Carbohydrates, lipids, proteins, nucleic acids. Which of those are made, at least in part, out of nitrogen? Proteins have an amino group, yeah? Do you remember that nitrogen atom on the amino acids? Yeah? If you do, then you remember that proteins, amino acids, require nitrogen. Anything besides proteins require nitrogen? Nucleic acids, DNA, each of those little bases in DNA has a little bit of nitrogen in it. And if you look at molecular pictures, you'll see that. Good, good. So what about phosphorus? Does it sound like anything? Nucleic acids. Every little nucleotide is made out of three pieces, a sugar, a phosphate, and a base. And in order to make a phosphate group, you have to have phosphorus, yeah? What else? How about phospholipids, yeah? In order to make a phospholipid, you need to have phosphorus, yeah? No phospholipids, no cell. No cell, no life, yeah? Is that good? Sulfur, only amino acids have sulfur, but again, no amino acids, no proteins. No proteins, no life, yeah? What about carbon? All of the above, yeah? Does that make sense? Every single one of those, the carbohydrates, lipids, proteins, nucleic acids, are based in carbon, yeah? Okay, so where do we get our carbon atoms? As human beings, where do we get them? From the food we eat, yeah? What did you guys eat today? Chickpeas, soy cheese. Yeah? I know. Tell me about it. People, see what happens when Whole Foods moves next door? Suddenly everyone's eating all this healthy stuff. What else? Anyone eat something less healthy? Cake. Say it again. Mac and cheese, yeah? I had ham for Easter, yeah? I hear your judgment there. Just back off. All right. So whether we eat animals or whether we eat plants, right? Ultimately, we're depending on plants for our food, yeah? Because the animals that we eat are eating plants. The animal products, the cheeses and eggs that we eat, are also dependent on animals eating plants. And then the soy cheeses and other plant-based products are directly dependent on plants. Yeah? Does that make sense? So all the carbon atoms in our body come from plants. Where did plants get their carbon atoms? From the atmosphere, right? They can capture carbon dioxide from thin air. Yeah? What percentage of Earth's atmosphere is carbon dioxide? It's actually a pretty tiny amount. I think it's 0.04%. Yeah? Although that number is changing. It's kind of a big deal. Yeah? So plants take carbon from non-biological sources, right? the air is not alive, and yet by the process of photosynthesis, plants can grab carbon out of the atmosphere and turn it into their bodies, yeah? They're a large part, right? You are what you eat, right? A large part of what is now my body used to be sitting in a box in the cereal aisle at the Try and Save. True? Yeah, if I eat a lot of cereal, then a lot of what my body is made out of used to be cereal, yeah? Likewise, everything that a plant is, or a lot of, I shouldn't say everything, but a lot of what a plant is, used to be floating in the atmosphere, yeah? Does that make sense? And they've captured it out of the atmosphere and put it into their bodies as carbon compounds, right? Then animals eat it. How does the carbon get back into the atmosphere? We exhale it, at least in part. That's a big way in which carbon gets back to the atmosphere. Every time we breathe in, we're taking in oxygen. Every time we breathe out, we're dumping carbon dioxide made by the process of aerobic respiration. You guys with me here? And aerobic respiration returns carbon straight to the atmosphere in the form of carbon dioxide, yeah? So I exhale. A carbon dioxide molecule floats out of my mouth and then floats somehow down the stairs and then gets outside and floats out into the back lawn, yeah? And then there's a west wind that blows it over the Atlantic Ocean, yeah? And then some cyanobacterium floating on the surface of the ocean does photosynthesis and captures that carbon atom in that carbon dioxide molecule, and then that little alga, that little unicellular photosynthetic microbe gets swallowed by a little piece of plankton, a zooplankton, and then the little zooplankton gets eaten by a little fish, and then the little fish gets eaten by a bigger fish, and then the bigger fish gets eaten by a salmon, and then that salmon gets fished out by a Boston-based fishing boat, yeah, and then gets fed to my wife on a plate of grilled salmon, yeah? I suppose, yeah? You ever think about that? Right? Let me ask you this. How old are the carbon atoms in your body? As long as there have been carbon atoms on Earth, it's the same ones, yeah? And the carbon atoms on Earth are just continually being recycled over and over and over. Is anyone going, whoa, is this whoa-worthy? It's pretty, I think it's a pretty far out thing, yeah? What happens to you when you die? Your body decomposes, doesn't it? Yeah? Worms eat you, and then bacteria eat the worms, and then the carbon dioxide from the bacteria get released back to the atmosphere, yeah? Does that always happen? What if your body gets embalmed? Right? If your body gets soaked in formaldehyde, it's harder for microbes to eat you, right? Because you're soaked in a toxic chemical, yeah? So those carbon atoms will stay around for a lot longer, yeah? You agree? So, and as it turns out, what if things get buried really quickly, they occasionally don't completely decompose, yeah? And those carbon atoms get trapped underground, yeah? They get sequestered. And then, you know, for us, well, that's one thing. But what about trees and plants 300 million years ago? Well, those trees and plants that get entire forests that get covered and don't decompose, yeah, those trees and forests will eventually, do you know what's going to happen to them? They'll form a fossil fuel. Yeah, have you guys heard of fossil fuels? Right? So you've heard of fossils, yeah? We can dig up Tyrannosaurus rex bones, or what used to be Tyrannosaurus rex bones, and they got replaced by minerals. They got mineralized. and they got compressed a little bit by the weight of the rocks on top of them. But along with fossils, fossil fuels are still, the carbon atoms are still there, and they've been compressed and geologically finagled by the intense pressure of the weight of all the rocks on top of them. In any case, microbes and plants that are buried without being decomposed are sequestered, yeah? And they become fossil fuels, right? The carbon atoms in those things become fossil fuels, and then what do we do with those fossil fuels? We use them, right? We dig them up and we burn them. We mine coal from the Appalachian Mountains, and that coal came from the Carboniferous period, where these huge forests of fern plants that were a couple hundred feet tall were compressed, and coal miners that look at the coal that they mine can often find little imprints of leaves and bark and so on in that coal. Nevertheless, we burn it to keep our houses warm and to, power the electric lights that we depend on. And I burn gasoline from diatoms and other photosynthetic microbes in oceans that also got turned into oil, another fossil fuel, and I use that to drive to school, yeah? When we do that, we are taking carbon that has been sequestered, that is basically sitting under the ground for millions of years, and we're putting it effectively back into circulation. Okay? Does that make sense? Is that a problem? It can be, yeah. We'll talk about that in a second. Yeah. So photosynthesis, right? Plants grab carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere. What happens to the carbon in the atmosphere when plants do photosynthesis? Go up or down? Goes down, yeah? There's less carbon dioxide in the atmosphere every time a plant does photosynthesis, yeah? What about when I keep flapping my mouth? Well, if that continues to happen, every time I exhale, the amount of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere goes up, and I contribute to global warming with the hot air from my pie hole, I guess is the term, yeah? Sequestration, again, when things die, sometimes their carbon can be completely broken down. Other times it gets stored and it takes millions of years for it to completely break down, or it never breaks completely down. Combustion, right? Once we dig the coal out of the ground, we light it on fire to get the heat out of it, yeah? And when we do that, carbon dioxide is a waste product, yeah? Again, the same carbon atoms exist on Earth which were here before life began and have been recycled in the carbon cycle for billions of years, yeah? The Tyrannosaurus rex poop that was mined out of the ground and then lit on fire, and then out of the power plant and into a corn field, and then into a kernel of corn, and then into the mouth of a chicken, and then into an egg that ends up on my plate, and I am eating Tyrannosaurus rex poop from 65 million years ago. Yeah? Yeah. Makes you feel like you're part of something big. Like a pile of Tyrannosaurus rex poop. Now that's big. Okay. Anyway, sorry. I'm glad that level of humor is not lost on this sophisticated crowd that we have here this evening. Right on. And I'm the one cracking the jokes. So anyway, so consequences of driving, yeah, again, when we dig gasoline out of the ground, we end up and burn it, we get carbon dioxide in the atmosphere. Yeah? Combustion of once sequestered fossil fuels adds to global warming by increasing the amount of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere. Yeah? You guys know this, the link between carbon dioxide in the atmosphere and global warming? Right? So basically, here it is. this is a radiation absorption pattern across wavelengths of light that various things, carbon dioxide, ozone, water, and so on have. And carbon dioxide absorbs a little bit of light, especially it absorbs heat very well over here, yeah? And so infrared radiation, carbon dioxide absorbs very well. Water absorbs a lot of light radiation and a lot of heat radiation. It's even more potent greenhouse gas than carbon dioxide. What about that? Well, much heat from solar radiation is trapped naturally, but when more is trapped, global warming occurs, yeah? So this is the greenhouse effect, yeah? And you experience the greenhouse effect when you get into your car sitting out in the parking lot on a sunny day, yeah? It's 90 degrees outside. You get in your car that's been sitting in the parking lot. How hot is it inside the car? It's not 90 degrees. It's crazy hot. It's 150 degrees inside your car. Why is that? Well, there's windows all over the car. The windows let the light from the sun in. The light from the sun hits the cushions of the seats of the car. The cushions heat up. When the cushions heat up, they actually start emitting infrared radiation. This is a different kind of radiation from light radiation. It's longer wavelength. And so the glass lets in the light radiation. It traps and doesn't let out the heat radiation, and the heat radiation gets trapped, yeah? Does that make sense? So that's how your car gets hotter and hotter and hotter, is by letting light in but not letting heat out. Does that make sense? Right? Likewise, when we have light shining on the Earth's surface heats up and it radiates heat the same way. We can see that when we look out over the parking lot, and we can see the shimmering of the heat being released from the surface of the parking lot, yeah? So that heat, the more carbon dioxide, right? The carbon dioxide traps the heat wavelengths, and the more carbon dioxide, the more efficiently the Earth traps that heat. Does that make sense? Right? So, are we putting more carbon dioxide into the atmosphere? Yes, we are. We measure the amount of carbon dioxide. We can measure it from, do you guys know where Mauna Loa is? It's in Hawaii, yeah? It's on the Big Island, and it's a mountain about 13,000 feet in the air, right? We measure there because it's high, and it's also isolated out in the smack dab in the middle of the Pacific Ocean. So, you know, the pollution from Beijing, the pollution from Los Angeles, the carbon dioxide emitted from those areas is going to get really mixed completely, or pretty darn well, before it ever gets the 2,000 miles away to the Hawaiian Islands. So it's a good place to get a pretty accurate reading. And you can see they've been measuring since the 50s, and it's been going steadily up with all the carbon that we dig out of the ground, yeah? But it's been going steadily up. That's the black trend line, year on year. But if we look month to month, we can see it goes up, then it goes down, then it goes up, then it goes down, then it goes up, then it goes down in a 1 year long cycle. And the cycle is extremely consistent and tight, yeah? What's going on there with that? It's seasonal, yeah? If it's going up and down every year, right, then what's making the carbon dioxide levels go down? Is that summer? Is that winter? What is it? It's actually, you might think it's winter, but it's actually summer. And the more sunlight you've got, the more photosynthesis happens. The more photosynthesis happens, the more carbon dioxide gets used. The more carbon dioxide gets used, the more this level goes down, yeah? Then in winter, there's less sunlight, there's less plants, right? The plants have fewer leaves. There's less photosynthesis going on in the northern hemisphere in the summertime, or in the wintertime rather, right? And the carbon dioxide levels go back up. Does that make sense? And they go up and they go down every year, but every year they go up a little higher and then they don't go down as much. And that net trend is coming from the extra carbon that we're digging out of the earth. Yeah? Does that make sense? So, yeah, so why do we care? Well, again, we keep trapping heat from the sun. The sun keeps on shining, and we keep trapping heat. Well, then ice starts to melt, which at this late stage of April, where I still see snow in my backyard, maybe that sounds like a good thing, but when the ice melts in my backyard, maybe not such a big deal. But if all of the ice on Earth melted, well, maybe we'd have a problem, yeah? If all the ice from the North Pole and the gigantic glacier sitting on Greenland, yeah, and all the ice on the South Pole, if that all melted, well, here's from National Geographic a speculative diagram of what the nation would look like. And, you know, I guess we could do without Florida, yeah? Adios, Florida. Nice knowing you. Yeah. Well, I guess losing Boston I might miss Boston too. Yeah. So, say it again. Just the Cape. Yeah, nuts to the Cape. Those people are annoying anyway. So, all right. So, facetious. It's being silly, of course. Yeah. I actually know some people that live in Florida and in the Cape, and they're all very nice people, and I would feel really bad if their houses all went underwater, yeah? And this presumably could be a fairly long, this is all of the ice in the South Pole, right? And the South Pole ice caps are being melted gradually and eroded, but we've got certainly a little while to go before all of the ice on the South Pole is melted, yeah? This is a speculation, and this is clearly, though, a huge problem, yeah? Okay. Questions? All right. So, can photosynthesis help with global warming? Yeah, sure, right? And in fact, plants grow better the more carbon dioxide you give them, the faster and more efficiently they tend to do photosynthesis, right? And that's helping every 6 months, right? But it's not enough to make the problem disappear. Okay, so we've learned about the carbon cycle, yeah? We know about sequestration, photosynthesis, respiration, combustion, and all how that interacts, yeah? Carbon starts in the atmosphere, goes into plants, goes into us, gets released back to the atmosphere, and occasionally can make a pit stop of undetermined length as it gets sequestered in the ground, yeah? You guys got it? All right, so much for that. Let's look at another geochemical cycle. This is the nitrogen cycle. We've talked about it a little bit. Charles asked some questions about it, but before we talk about it, let us consider this entertaining math problem, yeah? Raise your hand. Do not shout out answers because I want everybody to have the excitement of solving this one on their own. You have 11 wheels, 25 frames, 100 saddles, 200 pedals. How many bicycles can you make? Don't shout out the answer. Raise your hand and think about it, everybody. So I got 1, 2, 3, 4 people raising their hands for an answer. What do you guys think? People are saying 5. Is that the right answer? Yeah, so is that the right answer? Is 5 the right answer? Yes, it is. All right. So, next question, which bicycle part determines how many bicycles you can make? Raise your hand. Daisy, the wheels, yeah? The wheels limit our ability to make bicycles, yeah? In order to have a bicycle, how many wheels do we need? 2. And if we only have 1 wheel, what do we have? You don't have a unicycle. You have a frame, pedals, and 1 wheel and a saddle. You have kinetic sculpture, yeah? Try to ride that one-wheeled bicycle and call it a unicycle for a minute and put it on YouTube, and I want to see what happens, yeah? So does that make sense? Without any of these, if you were short on pedals, you would not be able to make a practical bicycle, yeah? No pedals, no bike. No frame, no bike. No saddle, no bike, yeah? All of these are necessary to make a bicycle. And when you run out, so what if I'm working at a bike shop and we have these parts and we assemble our 11 or our 5 bicycles, if somebody from UPS shows up and says, hey, guess what? I heard you guys are in trouble. I'm going to save the day. Here is 300 more saddles. How many more bikes can we make? 0, right? You understand? All right. And so if we got wheels instead of saddles, then suddenly the number of bikes we would be able to make would skyrocket to what number? 25. We'd go to the next limiting factor. Does that make sense? All right. So why are we talking about this? Well, because many of these geochemical cycles can be limiting. In terrestrial ecosystems, in ecosystems on land, the amount of nitrogen available in the soil is often the primary determinant of how many crops you end up getting when you're growing something like corn. Yeah? Where does that nitrogen come from? Well, the biggest reservoir of nitrogen, do you understand what I mean by reservoir in this context? Yeah? When I say reservoir, I mean the place where you find water, I guess, in water reservoirs. But in the case of the nitrogen cycle, the place where you find a lot of nitrogen, and that's the atmosphere, yeah? Where is the biggest reservoir of carbon on Earth? Carbon. When we're talking about the carbon cycle, where's the big reservoir for carbon? It's actually underground. Most of the carbon is actually still sequestered, yeah? There are several atmospheres, whole atmospheres of carbon under the ground that we have not yet dug out and burned yet. Nevertheless, another major reservoir is biomass, yeah? Certainly. That would be a secondary reservoir. The biggest reservoir for carbon is sequestered, yeah? The nitrogen cycle, the big reservoir is the atmosphere. 78% of the Earth's air is nitrogen, yeah? And this nitrogen, again, is N2, and N2 has a triple bond. And if it's got a triple bond, that bond is really hard to break. You need a lot of energy, and you need a particular enzyme, and only bacteria have that enzyme, yeah? Nitrogen-fixing bacteria, though, often form endosymbiotic partnerships with legumes. Do you guys know what legumes are? They are certain kind of plants. They're plants that form beans, yeah? Peas, peanuts, kidney beans, soybeans, those are all legumes, yeah? And one of the special things about that particular group of plants is that they make things called nodules. These little, can you see these pictures of their roots? And this root has a lot of little bumps. And these little bumps are called nodules, and effectively they're little condos for bacteria to go live in. Yeah? Why do the bacteria, or why do the plants make little condominiums for bacteria to live in? Because they produce nitrogen, and the plant wants nitrogen. Yeah? The soil can be depleted of nitrogen, and if it's depleted of nitrogen, plants like corn fail. Crops like corn will fail if there's no nitrogen in the soil. Crops like legumes will be okay because they can pay bacteria to hook them up with some nitrogen. Yeah? How would if you were a plant, how would you pay bacteria that can fix nitrogen for you? Do you have anything of value that a bacterium would want? You have carbon, don't you? You can do photosynthesis. You have your own sort of money-making machine, right, which is photosynthesis. And you can give them as much carbon as photosynthesis from the sun will allow you to make, yeah? In return, they can give you as much nitrogen as they can get from their enzyme, which depends on ATP, yeah? And that ATP can be generated by stoking them with carbon. Does that make sense? All right, so it's kind of neat, the relationship that these plants have with these bacteria. The bacteria sneak into their roots, and then once they're inside some of the cells fill up with little bacteria, yeah? And we get these little condos. So the plants and the bacteria have a mutually beneficial, mutualistic, endosymbiotic relationship, yeah? Where they trade carbon for nitrogen. Yeah, Merlene? That sounds delicious, but those plants are not legumes. Those are so cabbage is a mustard, and carrots are in the nightshade family, if I'm not mistaken. But I'm not. You better not quote me on that. Yeah. So legume might be a recipe, the name of a particular dish, right? But a legume is a right? In the same way, have you heard of a dolphin fish? No, don't stop recording. This will just take a second, right? Right? Have you guys heard of this fish, the dolphin? Is that a dolphin? It's not a dolphin. A dolphin is this thing, yeah? Does that make this? But we call this thing's name is dolphin, yeah? It's a fish that has the name dolphin, but it doesn't make it a mammal just because it has that name. Likewise, a delicious dish with cabbage and carrots and meat in it sounds yummy, but it's not legumes. Does that make sense? Okay. All right. So legumes are a specific kind of plant, and that's yeah. So photosynthesis fixes carbon. And when I say fixes carbon, that means capture it. It means, have you heard the expression catch that and paint it green? Yeah, so plants do that, right? They capture carbon dioxide out of thin air and turn it into a green plant, yeah? Likewise, nitrogen fixing is taking a gas, nitrogen gas, and turning it into things like amino acids, right? So the term fixing means capturing out of thin air. That's the best definition of the term fixing that I can come up with. All right, so as it turns out, again, pretty much nearly all of the nitrogen in the nitrogen cycle comes from nitrogen-fixing bacteria, yeah? As helped, facilitated by the help of leguminous plants and bacteria, yeah? Nitrogen-fixing bacteria. There are other forms of nitrogen. There are nitrogen oxides, but all of those have to come from nitrogen in the atmosphere, yeah? They got this really awesome enzyme that can break a triple covalent bond. And once they do, those nitrogen atoms can react with hydrogen atoms in water or in acid to make ammonia, and then that ammonia can be latched onto a carbon compound to make an amino acid. Is that good? Great questions, yeah. So as it turns out, when we grow corn, right, corn is a very productive plant, but it leaches nitrogen out of the soil. Often, the old days, they used to rotate their crops, and you grow corn one year, and that would make the amount of nitrogen in the soil go down. Then you'd grow alfalfa or soybeans or something like that, and that would bring nitrogen back into the soil. Nowadays, there's also something else, the Haber process. And the Haber process is a chemical process of fixing nitrogen. So up until about 1905, at the same time that Einstein was thinking up the theory of relativity, Fritz Haber, Einstein's buddy, was thinking up a way to fix nitrogen using a chemical process, using a big power chemical plant instead of using a bacterium. Yeah? And so the Haber process consumes 3 to 5% of the world's natural gas is devoted to this Haber process. And as it turns out, the fertilizer made from this process it's calculated is responsible for sustaining 1/3 of the Earth's population. Crazy, isn't it? So this chemical process, we generally think of chemical processes as sort of unnatural and bad and so on. What a weird thought that we're depending on that for our lives. You could think of this, right, sustaining 1/3 of the Earth's population, right? In other words, 1/3 of the nitrogen atoms in your body right now didn't come from bacteria fixing nitrogen. They came from a gigantic chemical plant fixing nitrogen, yeah? The nitrogen atoms that are in your body, unless you're eating organic 24/7, the nitrogen atoms in your body came in large measure from this process, yeah? And I live in California, and in the Central Valley, it's very flat, and it's really ideal agricultural land. And when you drive on I-5, which goes north and south along the Central Valley, you can see these tanks of anhydrous ammonia from the Haber process on the backs of 18-wheel trucks. As you drive along, they're driving right next to you, carrying around this nitrogen that is literally sprayed into the soil to make the soil fertile for growing more crops, yeah? And then again, I eat the crops, and so the nitrogen atoms that were in this tank are now in me, yeah? What a weird thought. Is nitrogen from this process more unhealthy? Atoms are atoms, yeah? Maybe having chemical fertilizers often comes with pesticides. Pesticides are toxic, yeah? But as far as the nitrogen atoms in your body has no idea, and it makes no difference at all whether those nitrogen atoms were grown on an organic farm or whether those things were made in a chemical plant. They're still nitrogen atoms. Does that make sense? Right? That's not to say that this is a great idea or anything, but again, at the level of the atom, your body is not going to know the difference. Yeah? So why don't they use the bacteria? Well, I guess that's a great question. Well, I guess one answer to that is that in terms of the amount of food per acre that you can get from growing beans and you can get from growing corn, it's pretty tough to beat corn in terms of calories per acre, yeah? Why not grow the bacteria in a gigantic vat? What a great idea. What's that? Yeah, so those bacteria would have to be fed. They would need to be, we'd need to get a bunch of high fructose corn syrup and dump it in there to feed them. But, there's nothing written in stone that I know that says that that doing it in a chemical way would be less efficient. Yeah, there would be things that would have to be overcome, right? And a plant has an advantage; it's got solar panels all over it. Yeah, but as far as why that can't be done, certainly enzymes are far more efficient at catalyzing chemical reactions than the nickel catalysts that Fritz Haber came up with in 1905. Yeah, And the process, this process of nitrogen fixation that Haber concocted with the help of a couple of other guys is not, it's not that efficient. It's slow. It's energy intensive, right? So we're spending the energy here, right? But you know, that doesn't fully answer your question, because why not just grow the legumes? Yeah. Well, maybe the reason is because there's maybe it's the fault of us as citizens that we don't eat enough. I don't eat enough peanut butter sandwiches, and I don't eat enough hummus. Yeah. And if I ate more hummus and peanut butter sandwiches, maybe there'd be a greater demand for legumes, and you know, some of the need for chemical fertilizers should certainly go away if that were done, don't you think? I would think so. And again, these are, all I do is bloviate, so there's not much difference, yeah? Yeah. Any other questions? Okay. So, so along with, there's one other cycle, and that's the phosphorus cycle. Again, there's others in your textbook. I'm just trying to give you a taste of it all. We've talked about limiting nutrients. Those will be relevant to your homework. The phosphorus cycle is needed to make nucleic acids and phospholipids. There's no gaseous components. A lot of the reservoir of phosphorus is in minerals and rocks that the Earth is made out of. Those rocks get exposed to the elements. Those phosphates often dissolve really easily. And they're also really easily absorbed by plant roots, yeah? And so, so there's no real problem absorbing phosphorus through plant roots. They can just soak it right up. Phosphates often have been limiting in aquatic systems, yeah? And that was a real problem, I think, in the 60s when people were letting their phosphorus-containing detergents flow into freshwater ecosystems. And in those freshwater ecosystems, if phosphorus was limiting, then once we add phosphorus, what happens? We get, boom, we get overgrowing. In the same way, boom, we get lots of bicycles when we add a big shipment of wheels. Does that make sense? And that was causing things like an algal bloom, yeah? And an algal bloom, you might think of it as a good thing. Algae are green, they're doing photosynthesis and so on. On the other hand, for the individual lakes that were involved, they went from being pristine, clear blue lakes, which were, you know, yeah, they became green, slimy lakes, yeah? And the amount of oxygen once the phosphate is used up, all those algae start to die, and once they die, they start to decompose, and once they decompose, the decomposers start consuming oxygen. So what actually would end up happening is the oxygen underneath the surface of those lakes would plummet, and there would be fish kills and so on. It was a big problem, I think, back in the days. And I think nowadays that seems to be less of a problem, either because we're being more careful about where we dump our detergents, or because the detergents are prepared in such a way that they have less phosphate that gets released to the environment. Yeah? Yeah. So the fact that phosphate pollution caused fish kills and dead zones in freshwater ecosystems, and the fact that that problem seems to have gone away a little bit, has not stopped nitrogen fertilizers from places like California's Central Valley or Iowa or all these places that grow tons and tons of corn and use tons and tons of nitrogen fertilizers. Those nitrogen fertilizers go into the Mississippi River, and then they flow out into the Gulf of Mexico, as Rebecca is pointing out, and then those cause algal blooms, and then those algal blooms, after they go away, cause big hypoxic, state-sized hypoxic regions where there's no oxygen that fish can breathe, and suddenly you have a complete dead zone in the Gulf of Mexico. Yeah. So interesting and somewhat serious business. Yeah. Okay. So is this a good time to take a break? We're now at almost 8 o'clock. Yeah. And I've done nothing but blab. We don't have any lab going on today. I think it's tomorrow. Yeah. So just nothing but mind-numbing lecture. And I'm having a ball. How about you? Sorry. I suppose that's not very fun.